Hi guys, welcome back to Blog once again. So in this video we are going to create a simple HTTP server in C, and this is a console based C project, and it will show you how to handle socket, accept client connection, and respond with a simple HTTP page. So let me create a file first. So I'll say server.c, right? And what we're going to do, we are going to here first import all the libraries that I needed. So let me import first, and then I'll explain what all these library does. So include, and we'll say studio.h, and then we'll say include stdlib.h, right? And we are going to say hashtag include, and next one we are going to say string.h because we need to handle the string, and we'll say include, we'll also include the unix. So we'll say unistd.h, that is basically for handling the unix standard reading and writing and closing the files. So we can say, and then we'll say hashtag include, and arpa comma we'll say inet.h, right? This is for the definition, for for the defining the internet and the operation. And the next one we're going to include, that is for the creating the socket, that basically work for the core socket. So we'll say include, and we'll say sys, and then we are going to say socket.h, right? And the last one here is going to be, we are going to define structure like socket address underscore in, right? So we'll say hashtag include net inet, and then we're going to say in.h, right? So the first one is the basic standard input output. stdlib.h, basically it work for the standard library that say we use for the exit and malloc and free, right? String is basically for handling the string operation, that is getting the string length and copying the string and like this kind of things. And the fourth one is the unix standard, right? So this is the unix standard library. And the fifth one is for we are going to use this for the definition for internet operation, right? And the sixth, this one, the system and then socket.h, we are going to use this for core socket function, like where we need to create the socket, we need to bind this socket, and we need to listen the socket, and we need to accept the socket, right? So, and the last one, we are going to use this to define structure like address, right? And next step is going to, we are going to define the port number for our server. So we'll say hashtag define, and we'll say port 8080, right? So this is, we have defined our port number for our server, and now we are going to define buffer size for reading the client request. So define, we'll say buffer underscore size, yeah, and we'll say 1024, right? So this is like the define port is for defining the port number for our server, and define buffer size is basically defining the buffer size for reading the client request. Now we will declare our main function. So we'll say main, and this, yeah. So this is our main function. Now we need two things here. First, the file descriptor for server and the client socket. So we'll define a variable. So we'll say int, we'll say server underscore fd, that is the file descriptor, and the socket, new socket, right? So we have defined our file descriptor for server and client socket. Next, we are going to define structure to hold the server address information. So we'll say struct and we'll say sock address underscore in, and then we'll say address, right? And we'll say address length equals to size of address, right? Next thing, we are going to define the buffer to store the client request. So we'll say char buffer and we'll say buffer size. So this is for the like we have created the file descriptor for server and client socket, and this is a structure to hold server address and info, that is basically information. And this line indicates that we are creating a buffer to store the client request. Now we are going to basically create the socket. So let this create socket. Yeah. So we'll say server fd equals to, let me write this first and then I'll explain what I'm doing here. So this is the socket, and we're going to say af underscore inet, and then we'll say sock stream, yeah, here it is, and then we'll say 0, right? So af inet is basically IP version 4, sock stream and 0 is basically socket stream is basically TCP, and we are choosing a default protocol, that is 0, right? 0 is basically TCP default protocol. Socket stream is basically, we said that we are using TCP here, and 0 we said we are choosing default protocol, right? Now we'll check if server underscore fd equals to 0. So we'll say error and we'll say socket failed, right? And in the next line we'll exit the program. So we'll say exit failure, right? Otherwise we are going to say we are going to define the address in the next step. So we'll say addresses addresses dot sin, and we are saying family, that is basically we are defining the IP version 4, and we'll say af underscore inet, right? So this is the IP version 4. Now we're going to accept the connection from any IP. For that we'll write addresses dot sin, and we're going to say address, and we'll say dot s underscore, we'll say s underscore address, and we can say in addr, and we'll use address any. So this line will basically accept connection from any IP, right? Now we are going to convert port to a network byte address, right? So addresses, then we are going to sign port equals to, we'll say honest, yeah, and then we'll say port. So these three lines are very, very important. So the first one is we are saying IP version 4 address, and the second one we say accept connection from any IP, and the third line say convert port to network byte address. Now we are going to we are going to bind the socket to port. For that we'll say if bind, right, and we'll say server fd, and we'll say struct no, it will say struct, and then we'll say sock. Yeah, right. So we have said that we are binding the address. So we said that this, and then we'll asterisk, and we are going to say address, and then the size of the addresses, and it is going to less than 0, right? So here we are binding the address that we have defined the server, we have defined the structure basically address, structure address, and then we are checking the size. So if size is less than 0, then we'll say p error, and we're going to say binding, or you can say bind failed, right? Or and we'll say exit failure, right? And then we are going to listen for a connection. If this doesn't happen, it means our connection has happened, and we are going to listen that connection. So we'll say listen connection, right? For listen connection, we'll say if listen, and we'll say server ft comma 5 is less than 0. So then we are going to listen. So we'll say p error. So we are also checking here if the server is listen for connection is less than 0. Basically the value is if less than 0, then we are going to say listen failed. So we'll say listen failed, right? And we'll say exit, and exit failure. Otherwise we are going to write here printf server is listening, or we can say server is running on, the server is running on port, or we can say running on http localhost, right? This is going to be a local host, and then we'll say %ild for the port, and then backslash n, and we are going to pass the port here. Yeah. So first we check the if the connection is bind or not, and then we'll check if the connection is listening or not. If the connection is not listening, then it will say exit failure, like the listen is failed. And if the connection is listening, then it will say server is running on http localhost and then port 808, right? That we have defined. Now what we are going to do, we are going to accept the connection, right? Till now we have bind the connection, we have checked the listen the connection. Now we are going to say accept the connection, right? So we are going to say new underscore socket equals to, we'll say accept, and we are going to say server ft, and we have to, let me just copy this because I have to write this. Yeah, and then we'll say socket length, and this is going to be inside bracket, and the asterisk address length, right? So we'll say new socket. We have said here new socket, right? So while you're getting error here, say new socket is undefined. Okay, let me correct this. I've written wrong here. Yeah. So now I get this new socket, and then we are going to check if like connection is accepted or not. If connection is if we are going to say new socket is less than 0, then we'll say connection failed. Otherwise, we'll say accept this, right? So if, let me just copy this. So and we'll say here the accept failed, and here is going to be a new socket, right? New socket is less than 0, then we are going to say connection failed. Otherwise, we are going to read the client request, right? So let me write this, read client request, right? So we'll say read new socket buffer, right? And then we are going to do say buffer size, and we'll say printf client request, and we'll say x less than percentile less, because we are going to listen in a string format, and we'll say x less than, and then we are going to pass the buffer, right? So till now we have checked we have created the socket, we have checked if the socket is binded or not, then we have checked if the socket is listening or not, right? Then we printed the server is running on this port, and now we are accepting the connection. So we created here the new socket, and then we check here that new socket is accepting the connection or not, and then we are reading the client request. Now we have to send HTTP request, HTTP response, right? So we'll say send HTTP response, right? Response. For that, so let me just copy paste this, because I have a piece of code here. Yeah. So this is what we are going to send in a response. Now we are going to write this. So we'll say why I'm getting this error, constant expected. Okay. Yeah. So we have to write this to the in a response, right? So we'll say write and new socket HTTP response, and then str length, yeah, this one, and then we'll say HTTP response, right? And we'll say next, in the next line we'll print the message that is response sent to client. Say printf, we'll say response send to client, and we'll say \n. Now the last step is going to be we need to close the socket and the server. So we'll say close the socket. So we are going to say we are going to say close new socket, and then close server ft file, and the final one we are going to return 0, because we have declared the main and we have to return something, right? So this is our simple code that basically create HTTP server in a C. So what are we going to do? We are going to, let me explain this first one by one, and then no. So where we are? Yeah. So yeah, this is the. So let me explain this one by one. What I am doing. So first we have included all the necessary libraries. The first one is for the standard library. This one is for the exit for the exit function, malloc function, and free string for the doing the string operation like and getting the string length and copying. And the UniSTD is basically for Unix standard library, right? And this one is for the definition for internet operation, right? And this is for the creating the socket function, that is basically it said core socket function, right? And this is for the defining the structure, right? Now here we are defining the port, we are defining the buffer size for reading the client request, then we define the file descriptor for server and client socket, then we define the structure to hold the server address info, and then we define the buffer to store client request. Now what we're doing, we are creating a socket here. So socket is created, that is the AF init is basically IP version 4. Sock stream is the TCP, and the geo is basically say choose default protocol, right? So we check here if the connection, if the socket is created or not. If it is not created, then it says socket failed. Otherwise, we are going to define the addresses. So the first the address is basically IP version 4, and the second is accept connection from any IP, and the third one basically convert port to a network byte or order, right? And here we are binding the connection, we are checking if the connection is bind or not, and then we are checking if the connection is listening or not. So if the connection is bind and the connection is listening, then we'll print. We are printing here that server is running on localhost and the port number, right? Next thing what we are doing, we are accepting the connection. So we are accepting the connection here, and we are saying we are checking if the acceptation, like basically connection acceptation is working or not. If it is not accepting, we'll say acceptation failed. Now in the next line we are saying we are reading the client request, and in the next line we sending the response. We are writing to the user, and we'll say request sent to client, and then we are closing the file descriptor and the socket. So let's compile it and run it. So we'll say gcc server.c minus -1, we'll say server. So we have successfully compiled it. Now what we're going to do, we are going to run this. So this will say server. So it says server is running on HTTP localhost. So let me open this. Oh, close this file somehow. Yeah. So it says server is running on localhost. So let me bring the browser here, and I'll say HTTP localhost. I'll say 8080. See, we got welcome to my C HTTP server, right? That we have written in our program. See, we have added this. That's why we are getting. So we can say welcome to HTTP server on block, right? So let's compile it again, and let's run it. So we'll compile this, and we have compiled it, and we have run it. Say bind failed. Okay, let me delete this file. Yeah. So let me compile this, and let me run this. Okay, I think I need to close this file first. Yeah. So let me clear this, and we'll say why it's saying bind fail addressing already used. So let me delete this, and we'll say gcc server. Yeah, now it's a server running on HTTP localhost. So I'm going to use this again. Okay, let me run this. Yeah. So we have changed this text. We have added this more. So let's see either we got the change or not. So we'll say HTTP localhost. Yeah. See, we got this right. So that's how like you build your and we have built our the simple HTTP server using C, right? So that's how you can build your simple HTTP server using C. Like so what we've done, I'll just recall this. So first we have include the standard input output library, whatever the library we needed. Then we define the port and we define the buffer size. Then we define the file descriptor and then structure for the address to storing the address, and then we define the buffer size that basically store the client request. And we are creating the socket. Once the socket is created, we are defining the addresses, the IP version for the accept connection from any IP and convert port to network byte. Then we check the if the connection is binding or not. Then we check if the connection is listening or not. Then we are accepting the connection, and then we are reading client request, what client is requesting, and then we are responding to the client request, right? And then we are closing the connection, right? So that's it. Like that's how you create a simple HTTP server in C. Right. So see you to the next one. Thank you.